Welcome to Psychology of the Daf. We are on Daf Kuf Mem, and here we have one of the most famous Gemaras where Rav Ḥisda gives advice to his daughters on how to be sexually appealing and sexually attractive. The Gemara itself says that Rav Ḥisda would teach his children by example and by way of metaphor. In his hands, in one hand he would have a pearl, in the other hand he would have a clod of dirt, and he would show them the pearl right away in his hand, and he would wait until their curiosity and the tension built, and then he would show them after that the clod of dirt. And the lesson is that even something as beautiful as a pearl, you experience one level of desire and pleasure if you can see it right away. But even something as regular and ordinary as dirt, when you let tension and curiosity build, you end up developing much more interest and desire. And of course, this is a wonderful metaphor for both modesty and sexual teasing, that there's a time to be covered and then there's a time to slowly reveal. And if that's played out correctly, then even perhaps a person who's ordinary looking can become very attractive if that is played correctly, because there's a curiosity and there's a desire to see and know more. And perhaps even somebody who's very attractive, who is not in any way showing any type of modesty or any type of teasing and playfulness, is not very attractive. And that may have many lessons to us in terms of the value appropriately applied, non-oppressively, but the value of modesty in the bedroom and out of the bedroom appropriately applied. Now, Rashi develops this idea much more specifically. Rashi says that the pearls represent the breasts and the clod of dirt represents the lower area, perhaps because it's more earthy, or it's where you sit on the ground, or it's where children come from. Plants come from the earth. The ancients saw the idea of water fertilizing the earth as a very similar idea as a man and woman being together and producing a child, so that the woman is considered like the earth, like the receiver of the seed. Whatever the case may be, it's certainly not derogatory, but what the point that, according to Rashi, Rav Ḥisda was making even more specifically was that in some type of sexual teasing and sexual foreplay, the upper area allow access to much more earlier than the lower area, so that the desire builds up greatly. Okay, so that's the discussion as far as Rav Ḥisda and Rashi and Rav Ḥisda's daughters. Now, if we look at the Rambam in Hilchos Ishus, Perek Tes Vav, Halacha Yud Ches, the Rambam says something that seems to contradict this Gemara. The Rambam says, "V'lo simna mibala kedei latzaro ad sheyosef ba'avasa." A woman should not withhold sex from her husband until he, quote, loves her more, which in this case Hebrew doesn't necessarily capture the English word, because over here desiring a woman is not necessarily love, it's lust. But in Hebrew it looks like, at least in the Rambam's Hebrew, it looks like that's what he means over here. So she should not withhold sex to cause him distress, so that he will want her more and desire her more. He should cede to his request any time that he wants. Now, that's actually not so simple, because the Rambam in Hilchos Ishus, Perek Tes Vav, Halacha Yud Zayin, says that it's actually v'lo yenos osov yivil bar korcha ela b'daita mitoch sich v'simcha. A man should never force his wife to be sexual, and he should never be sexual with her against her will. Notice the repetition. In other words, there's two different violations. A man should not force, which of course would be awful, but even just be sexual with her without her will, without her consent, that she doesn't really want it. And then the Rambam goes further and says, "Ela b'daita umitoch sicha v'simcha." Only with her consent, explicitly with her consent. It doesn't mean she has to say the words yes, like in today's strange times we live in, but it means that it really needs to be with her will, with her wanting it. And mitoch sicha, from engagement, from discussion, from intercourse, except in this case we mean verbal intercourse, from discussion, v'simcha, and joy. So there's a dialectical tension between the two poles here. On the one hand, it seems to be forbidden for the woman to withhold sexuality, even if the intention is to cause a greater arousal and greater interest, which we'll have to discuss soon. But first we have to just cover the actual dialectical tension between the two Rambams, and then the Rambam says that the sexuality has to be with consent, and with her, not just with consent, but with her will, and through joy and happiness. And so what do we see over here? So we see that oftentimes in the Torah, in the legality of the Torah, there are dialectical tension where you have opposite concerns being both addressed legally, and the idea is to create some kind of imprecise, adjustable meeting place between two ends. So, for example, in Kibbut Av V'Aim, we have a very similar situation where there's an obligation for children to show honor for their parents at almost extreme amounts, even if they're being humiliated, and otherwise there's an obligation to show honor for their parents. And yet there's also an obligation that parents do not make themselves tyrants and burdens on their children. So the halacha is capturing two poles and somehow creating this tension that in the tension in between, in each situation, there'll be some kind of adjustment where, due to the circumstances, there'll be some meeting in the middle. The idea when the halacha does that, it does it on purpose, because there is no specific formula. That's the important thing to understand about Torah Shebaal Peh. There is a reason, it's not random. There's a reason why some things are Torah Shebiksav and written, and there's some things that are oral. It's not just to make us busy and to make things complicated. It's that there are some things that cannot be captured fully in any particular word. In different circumstances, a parent should be more demanding and more burdensome, and in different situations less. In different circumstances, a child should be more tolerant and more obsequious even of a parent's desires than otherwise. And same over here. There's a dialectical concern. On the one hand, in a happy and healthy marriage, there's a recognition that the spouses have sexual obligations toward each other. It goes both ways. There are sexual obligations. Each one has a responsibility to, in some way, provide sexual pleasure for the other. Yet it never should be forced, and it never should be against a person's will, which is one notch below force, but it shouldn't be either really against their will. It should be totally willful. So you see this tension, because in each situation, you're going to have to, as a thinking, rational human being with a head and a heart, you're going to have to think of what's appropriate. Now, let's go back to the problem with the Rambam. The Rambam seems to say that a woman is not allowed to withhold sexuality, even if the intention is to create more arousal. Clearly, the way of learning the Gemara over there by Rashi and other Mefarshim is that Rav Ḥisda was counseling his daughters to do so. And there are different ways of answering it, but the answer that makes the most sense to me, it comes from the Ma'aser Rokeach, which is one of the Nosei Kelim on the Rambam, and he says the following. He says that there are two different situations. One is during the act of foreplay, and the other one is in general. So in general, it's considered cruel, it's considered sexual blackmail to hold back sexuality. In other words, to announce, I am not going to be sexual with you, to create some kind of hard-to-get circumstances, some kind of desire. While it might create desire, that's considered sexual blackmail, and that's forbidden, according to the Ma'aser Rokeach's interpretation of the Rambam. However, the Benosei to Rav Ḥisda, the situation of Rav Ḥisda's daughters meant during the act of overall foreplay being sexual, the fact that they hold back some in order to create a certain tension and desire, that's understood as playful teasing. Now, of course, again, it's important to understand here that we are talking about ordinary situations. There are situations where if a woman is being abused, mistreated, or there's a danger of or a fear of contracting some kind of sexual disease because she has reasonable suspicion that her husband has not been faithful. Obviously, there are different circumstances that possibly or do not allow being sexual, and those kinds of things are very different. We're talking about an ordinary relationship where there is a basic understanding and everybody's able to be a normal husband and wife together. There are also situations where, for whatever reason, the shalom bias is so deeply affected that the sexuality does not feel with consent, and it doesn't feel that it's coming from love and joy. And the point of this is not to provide sexual blackmail and not to be hostile, but to be honest and clear that there's a problem and that we need to feel closer and work together to be closer in order to fulfill our sexual responsibilities in a marriage in the proper way. And that is how those things should be broached. Of course, sometimes the power dynamics in a relationship make that very difficult to do, and that's when very experienced and understood rabbinic authority and or psychological authority should be sought. But in any case, the point is there is definitely a place, and it's considered valuable in ordinary circumstances to develop a certain amount of mystery, a certain amount of sexual tension, and at the same time, it's forbidden to have sexual blackmail, and at the same time, it's also forbidden for someone to feel coerced or pressured into sexuality when they are not willing to do so.